Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to the second part of our webinar series, Making the Most of Large Language Models for Research. Today, titled Trust and Reliability in Research, Make the Most of Scite Assistant, we'll dive deeper into Scite Assistant and share a complete prompting guide with examples after the Q&A, which you can use for your own research. If you weren't able to join part one last week, you don't have to worry about that. This webinar will still be very helpful for you independent of the first one, but after the webinar is over, I'll send both recordings to you so you can go back and listen to part one as well. Let me introduce our panelists today. Ashish Uppala is our panelist. He is the CTO of Scite, which is now part of the Research Solutions family. And in a previous life, he was a research fellow at the National Cancer Institute before he got cold feet from pursuing a PhD. He spent years developing his craft as a software and design consultant for various early stage startups and as an engineer in different industries. Research is still close to his heart, and he loves being able to leverage his skills to solve important problems facing researchers. Ashish, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Okay, a couple of quick housekeeping items and then right over to you, Ashish. So everyone here is in listen-in mode. We do have the chat enabled. So if you have a question, you can either use the Q&A where it says Q&A below, or if you have more of a technical issue, feel free to reach out via the chat, which I'll be monitoring. And then, as I mentioned, we're recording this webinar and I will be sending out the link to all of you afterwards. Okay, and maybe just one last note, the prompting guide, we will send that to all of you after the Q&A is over. So definitely stick until the end, and I think you'll find lots of value in it. Okay, Ashish, off to you.
Yep. Yeah, thanks, Julia, and thanks everyone for taking the time to come to another one of these. There's a pretty good turnout last time, and like Julia said, I think there's a recording of me somewhere on it that you can access and find. So I will say these webinars are going to be pretty self-contained, so it's not like a prerequisite or anything. And I have even fewer slides today than last time. So we're actually going to kill the slides. And if you know me at all, you know that I'm not a huge fan of slides. So what we're going to do today is try to make this more of a dynamic kind of experience where I talk through how I use Scite Assistant for research, especially in the context of prompting. But I think focusing around prompting specifically is a little misleading because the prompts do matter, but Assistant does a lot, as you'll see pretty soon, and it gives you a lot of control outside of just the prompts themselves. And so I'll kind of go through a couple examples. The nature of this kind of a webinar is that we're using kind of generative AI and these tools that necessarily don't behave the exact same way. So it's not like I have a script where I'm just doing X, Y, and Z. So what I'm going to do is, just kind of flip it on its head and do it live. And to the extent that you have questions while I'm asking, while things are loading, I'll try to answer them. So feel free to ask in the Q&A. Otherwise, we'll kind of do it at the end in a dedicated session. If no one interacts, I would be surprised if I take more than 30 minutes. So please feel free to interact. So, I think to start, I feel like whenever we do these demos, we always think of like a life sciences topic. I'm going to start with ChatGPT again, just to kind of set the stage and remind everyone what we're doing here. And what I want to do is maybe pick a sort of non-life sciences topic to start with. And so one of the ones that we use internally all the time is related to Peppa Pig, which is a children's cartoon that I personally have never watched, but maybe should. And so maybe, if you're like a parent or you're just kind of curious about Peppa Pig, maybe you're trying to wonder if it's good for your kids. So, let's just kind of see what ChatGPT says, and we'll kind of go into Scite Assistant pretty quickly after. So can you give me an overview of whether Peppa Pig is good for children? And what you'll probably get is a description of what it is, an outline of benefits. That this is kind of a classic ChatGPT response. There isn't a lot of information in terms of, like where it's pulling this information from. So you're kind of taking it at face value, but it's a pretty well-balanced kind of overview, right? You're getting some information in theory about benefits, about criticisms and things like screen time and commercialism, and the classic discussions of parental guidance always come up. And so you get this kind of vague, wishy-washy answer of it can be good, but it can be bad depending on how you use it. Let's compare that with Assistant. So I'm actually going to copy the prompt in here. I'm not going to do anything with settings and whatnot. And so we're just going to see what happens. If you're a Scite user or you're an enterprise customer and you've seen sort of our training demos and whatnot, it's going to feel a little familiar at the beginning, but I'm really going to focus on the assistant part of the experience in a way that we probably haven't before on those calls as well. So when you ask the same question in Assistant, the first thing it's going to do is figure out how to search for your answer, right? So it's like going to a librarian or a research assistant, where it's not just going to just throw words at you, but it's going to try to find information in our own database and then consult different kind of documents it finds to see, which of them have an answer to the actual question that you're asking. And so when it finishes, what you'll get is a question that you asked and then an answer with in-text references. So I think most of you are probably pretty familiar with this. And then you'll get a sort of high-level overview, right? It's a popular TV show. It's used as a tool for English language instruction, and it's kind of evolving into a cultural phenomenon. It's transitioning into a symbol with broader social implications. I'm not sure what's going on there. But what you kind of notice very quickly is that you can, you'll get like references to papers. So you're not kind of blindly trusting these generative answers, but you're able to inspect where it's kind of pulling or sourcing this information from. And so if you click on this, you'll actually see this 2024 article. So it's pretty recent, titled Peppa Pig, Experience Evolution and User Migration and Multi-Industry Creative Consumption. And they're kind of looking at, it's actually picking up this information in their abstract that's kind of referencing how like popular Peppa Pig is becoming. And so there's a couple of ways you can use Assistant right off the bat, right? If you're taking the classic ChatGPT approach, it's pretty useful to ask a question, get an answer. But it's also pretty useful if you want to actually ignore the answer itself and get a list of references that you might want to read. Maybe if, you're putting together slides for a course syllabus and you need some like recommended reading articles, or maybe you want to kind of use it as a launching pad for your own research. The references selected in the answer can actually be very valuable in themselves because you have a way of going from a natural language question to, like peer-reviewed research essentially, with kind of relevant and contextual information being surfaced to you. And so when you start to like go through these, you're like, okay, these are all talking about Peppa Pig, and it seems pretty interesting. But maybe you're looking at this answer and you're like, I actually want to know a little bit more, right? And what you can see here is that we have these kind of smart actions at the end. So you can say, I want a longer response, or I want to prioritize newer references, because maybe, you notice it's picking things from 2020 or 2017, and you're like, no, for my task, I need newer research only. Or you notice that it's pulling information from like different sections of the full text, and you think to yourself, for this task, the abstracts are probably enough. And so, you can kind of select any of these, and what will happen is it'll apply settings and regenerate the response. I'm not going to click one of these because I want to go into the settings themselves. The thing you kind of have to understand with Assistant is that when you ask a question, the first thing it does is it formulates a search strategy, right? So you can actually see the different keyword searches it's doing in our database. And it finds research articles that we've indexed in our own kind of database that might contain information relevant to the task that you have. And it'll also kind of use other sources to find foundational papers about your topic. And it'll start to kind of consult these after casting a pretty wide net. So it does this wide net based on keywords, and you can actually, open this up, right? And you can actually see the kind of classic keyword-based search it's doing and the types of documents that it matches in our system. And, if you look at this, you're going to go, oh my God, it's like picking up like all these random results that may or may not be related to what you're interested in, like over 100,000 documents. It starts to very quickly narrow that down to a list of like maybe the top 20 or 50 or so on publications, depending on your settings. And then it starts to re-rank them based on the kind of context and semantic meaning of your question, right? So you're essentially taking the question, translating it to keyword searches, finding documents, and then re-ranking them based on the kind of semantic meaning of your original prompt. And what it does is it finds not just publications, but also information from publications that are actually relevant to generate kind of an answer and surface the right bits of information. And what this means is that, one, you have a lot of visibility into how it works and what it's doing, but you also have a lot of control in telling it, go this way or do this, because I actually don't think you're kind of getting the right coverage. When you're looking at a tool like ChatGPT, you're kind of questioning what information and the data coverage and freshness really looks like. But here you sort of understand exactly what it's kind of pulling from and drawing from. And if it's not to your liking, you'll have some way of adjusting that. So because everything is tied to the search experience, you actually end up having a lot of control in how it kind of goes through the retrieval and ranking process. So you can always kind of open settings by going into this view here, or clicking on the cog, which spins around on the left. And when you open it, it'll give you kind of you're kind of popping open the hood, right? And you can do a lot of interesting things here, like specifying the year that documents should come from, the types of documents that you're actually interested in, because maybe you want to exclude things like preprints, or you only care about clinical trials or whatever. And in this case, maybe what we want to do is say, I want a longer answer and I want you to consult a lot more publications, right? You're only restricting it to like the top 20 or 50. I want you to kind of cast a wider net. And so you can hit apply. And if you're already in a session, so the settings are kind of a global default, you can hit regenerate here and it'll start to kind of run a new session using the new settings that you have. And so we'll kind of see what kind of an effect that has, but it'll, you're kind of constantly kind of balancing the signal to noise ratio, or the kind of precision and recall from a search perspective with Assistant. And you can use these settings to kind of dial it in based on the sort of domain and tasks that you're actually operating in. And so it's not this kind of black box that's like making all the decisions for you. You can use it that way. But if you want to go deeper and kind of control it as a tool, you have the ability to do that. And so what you'll find here is that it's actually looking through a bunch more documents, and you'll actually notice the response itself is just like, longer in length. And so there's a bunch more information and kind of a broader overview of the sort of topic. And so, if you actually go through these, you can actually find different references that are kind of looking at content. And this is actually pretty interesting, because like here's a 2018 article from PLOS, and it's kind of looking at like kids in China and like the pediatric population, but this is looking at like pigs in general, right? So this is actually that classic problem of like, how do you kind of tell assistants like what document is relevant to my task and have it actually exclude everything? And what happens here is like it looks at the word pig and it looks at the word pig and it goes, okay, we're trying to look at like kids and children and pigs, and so are these things good? And so it kind of falls into this trap of including irrelevant or noisy information in the process, because we cast like too wide of a net, and we're trying to force it to pick too many references than it needed to. And so we can actually try this in a slightly different way, where maybe we are curious about, let's actually open up a new session. I'll kind of illustrate this point a bit more clearly now. So what are counter arguments to the claim that Peppa Pig is good for children? So obviously, I'm going to show you two things. So the prompt you use actually makes a pretty big difference. So in the past, we were just looking at kind of a general overview, and it was casting a pretty wide net. Now it's, looking at the specific claim, but trying to find information that's kind of, on the flip side. We see the exact same process again. We're looking at a search, we're looking at publications, but you'll notice that the answer it generates is more focused on answering the question about counter arguments, right? So it's looking at things like the influence of media content, and still drafting an answer. It's looking at kind of shaping things like decision-making skills, themes of like stereotypes. So you'll see that the information it's pulling suddenly changes based on your interest in looking at kind of counter arguments here. So now it's doing a fact-checking step. So all that's going on here is it's taking what it wrote and making sure that it's actually backed up by whatever the cited papers are saying. And so you'll actually notice sometimes that it can delete what it wrote and revise based on the information. And so again, right? So we're actually only looking at 2 references here because it's kind of more narrow in scope. And let's see. So we're looking at Peppa Pig. So these are 2 references that seem pretty, like this is about Peppa Pig, but then here you kind of see a reference that's looking at discrimination, learning, and judgment bias in low birth weight pigs. So this has nothing to do with Peppa Pig, the cartoon, right? This is just looking at pigs because of the way that we prompted. You can actually modify it slightly. And so you can rephrase it to say, what are counterarguments to the claim that the Peppa Pig cartoon is good for children? And in the interest of sort of performance, I'm going to reduce this to not look at too many documents. I should still be able to prove my point. But when you do this and kind of hit the check mark, it'll regenerate the response using your new settings. And when it does this, hopefully the kind of responses and the references that it selects should be more kind of constrained to the cartoon itself versus just pigs in general. So we'll see how that works out. While I look at, I'm going to look at your questions while it's loading. What is better, a question or an affirmative sentence as a prompt? It depends on your task. I don't think one is inherently better than the other. So my recommendation is to kind of compare it for your actual task. Obviously we do a lot of our own prompt engineering under the hood. So if you're using ChatGPT for your own research and you've got a bunch of prompts in very specific ways, it won't necessarily play as directly nicely with like Assistant because we use different language models and our own set of prompts to kind of manipulate the behavior. So you'll probably need to kind of play around with it. And we can try some examples if you want, that you want me to look for. So, when we kind of go here, interesting. It actually, okay, so let's see. We're looking at, let me check my settings really quickly. Okay, so what are counterarguments to the claim that Peppa Pig cartoon is good for children? And so counterarguments from various perspectives. One aspect to consider is the potential impact of high stakes educational testing on children, right? So this is, clearly now like more focused on the children part, but isn't really looking at Peppa Pig specifically. And this is, obviously like not as relevant to what we want because in the past we were getting papers about Peppa Pig and all of a sudden we weren't. And so maybe it's because we kind of restricted the publications to be consulted too much. So we'll kind of expand this again and see if casting a wider net helps it find the right documents. So I'll try this again and see what comes up. Can it pull 2024 articles? So yes, our citation index updates pretty much every day. So we index metadata from research articles that are published pretty much every 24 hours. So you'll get information at a minimum on titles and abstracts and other metadata pretty much immediately. And then we also index information from the full text of research articles through open access content or through indexing agreements with publishers. And this varies a little bit. So open access content kind of comes in every single day, but then other types of content will depend on the publisher that we work with specifically. So to your question, Kevin, it's looking at both kind of abstract, but also these snippets that we've indexed in different areas. Can I put Peppa Pig in quotes? Yes, that is exactly what I was going to do. So you'll notice here again that it's looking at kind of, again, like references that may or may not be like fully relevant, right? So there's like this thing that's talking about Peppa Pig cartoon, which is like an interesting paper that the sorry, I'm just actually reading this. It's kind of interesting like what people write about Peppa Pig in research because you just don't think about it as much. But it turns out there's a lot of research kind of looking at Peppa Pig specifically. And so, there's some interesting research that it's kind of finding to pull it up. But Wayne, to your question, when the search strategy kind of comes up, you'll notice that, you can actually click on these and open them up, right? And at the end of the day, what we're doing is using our own search database to kind of find information. And this is a kind of classic keyword-based search experience. And you do Boolean queries, you can do all sorts of advanced stuff. So the easiest way to kind of understand the full range of what you can do is to go into the advanced tab in our search interface. And then you can actually start to kind of, create sort of queries that are looking at different terms on specific fields, like the title or the abstract or the citation statements, and kind of construct them. So maybe we're looking at kind of only papers that are looking at Peppa Pig in the citation statements, and then we kind of add the term. So it generates this kind of a search for us, and then we hit search, and this is the search that we're doing, and it's looking kind of across different types of research articles that might be interested in Peppa Pig. And maybe we're looking at this and we actually go, I want to do this in all fields, not just Peppa Pig. So let's just do Peppa Pig here in quotes, and search and see what comes up. And this should probably not have double quotes. That's probably a mistake. But what you'll find is that I'm going to delete these. What you'll find is that there's a bunch of articles now that are kind of looking at Peppa Pig explicitly in different aspects of their full text. And what you can do in Assistant is you can kind of hit edit searches and say, you know what, I actually want you to also just include that search because it seems like it'll improve the kind of signal to noise ratio of the articles that you're finding. And so you can always kind of edit them. You can delete other searches or edit any of the ones that the large language model decides are worth it. You can add new ones, and you can hit the check mark to apply your changes, and it'll incorporate the new search strategy that you had. And so you can actually see that visually here. I'm going to caveat this by saying that it's not just using these searches. It's actually like doing a couple other things under the hood to find other types of foundational papers if it can. Peppa Pig is probably not the best example for this because I don't know what a foundational paper on Peppa Pig research really is. But in theory, doing this should kind of improve the documents that we find. And in fact, we find a lot more papers. Here they're looking at kind of research, looking at kind of co-viewing cartoons with children. So you kind of see research looking at Peppa Pig and other kind of cartoons. And there's just a lot more relevant research kind of talking about Peppa Pig. And so, you don't just get an answer, but you kind of see why it's coming up. And if something is unexpected, you kind of have some way of kind of controlling that response. When I've historically done a lot of user research, I'll find that when people kind of don't get that level of control, they kind of trust things blindly. And then when they kind of see all this, they start to distrust things a bit more. But I'd kind of flip it on its head and say that, if you really push through and think through what's going on, being able to kind of nudge the tool in the right direction can actually give you a bit more kind of control and reliability and allow you to document exactly like how you're doing this, right? Like if you just prompt something in ChatGPT, you don't really know what's like happening over time or how it's changing over time. But here you can actually document the searches that are being run, how papers are being consulted, and to some degree how they're being selected. So you'll have a little bit more visibility there. I'm going to go through some more questions. When inputting a medium question in Portuguese, I had a response in English with Portuguese references. Okay, so yeah, this actually surprised me quite a bit because I wasn't expecting it. I don't have an example to use offhand, but one thing, so this is actually a good example, right? So there's actually Peppa Pig is in non-English text as well. It's clearly very popular research. There's actually like research articles that you'll find that we index in different languages, depending on the sort of the kind of where it was published. Sorry, just like my brain just froze. And when you do that in like a classic keyword-based search experience within Scite or other tools, we're not auto-translating text and so on. But one thing I've noticed is that if you ask Assistant questions in a different language, because we're using large language models under the hood, it'll actually translate that to English search queries and some kind of foreign language queries and find a mix of documents and synthesize the information back to English. I don't really necessarily speak Portuguese, or I can't really read Chinese, so I haven't been able to critically like evaluate that information. But I would try it and see what the behavior is. because there's something interesting to be said about the fact that, when you think about it from like a classic search or retrieval perspective, right? Like there's a lot of cool research that's written in English, but there's a lot of other really cool research written in different languages that you might be missing out on with other types of tools that you might actually kind of find hits on with Scite. So I'd encourage you to kind of try it and let us know. Can you limit your search by language of publication? That is a great idea. Actually, on a technical level, it's possible. You can't do it today, but I will think about that. So that's actually pretty good feedback. Does Scite work with articles only or other types of publications? So right now, our coverage is based on research articles with DOIs, but over time, we'll kind of expand this to other types of content as well. So if you've actually got feedback for your types of use cases on a data roadmap that we should be prioritizing, you should let us know, because we've been having, I would say, active discussions about that and what that looks like over the next couple quarters. Okay, I'm going to, so lots of questions coming in, but I'm going to go through one more thing just so I can kind of keep moving things forward. Because I thought I was going to be done by now, and I'm not. So let's pick a slightly different example. So the previous one that we did was really around GLP-1 agonists in the previous session. So we're looking at these kind of diabetes drugs. So I'm going to shift gears to like a topic where we have got a lot more coverage in the system, because Peppa Pig is cool but kind of obscure. So there's only so much I could show you with that. And then we'll kind of see how things go here. Because of the way that Assistant works in terms of query generation, in terms of re-ranking, the way you prompt can have pretty subtle but pretty important effects on the quality of the output itself. So let's say we're looking at sort of overview of GLP-1 agonists. The GLP-1 agonists are kind of class of drugs that there's been a lot of chatter about recently. And when you do like a generic prompt like this, you're going to get a generic kind of wishy-washy answer that's kind of all over the place without focus. But if you're doing in a sort of launching pad for discovery, this can be a pretty good way to start. While this loads, Janelle is asking non-OA full text content publishers, which publishers does Scite work with? There's a bunch of publishers that we work with. I forget if we have a list somewhere on the homepage. So we have some logos that you can kind of see. So these are publishers we have indexing agreements with. And I forget if this is a complete list and if we have one somewhere else, but follow up with us, and I'm sure we can kind of get that to you. But we started Scite back in 2018 really as a new citation index first, so we weren't like a generative AI company or anything like that. And so a lot of our focus was this core idea of improving citations by surfacing the context of citations. And so when you look at kind of the core unit of Scite, if you look at a research article, what you'll quickly find is not just kind of citation counts or lists of citing articles like a traditional index like Scopus or Web of Science, but also kind of snippets from the full text of citing articles, along with the section where the citation happened, and a classification from a deep learning model indicating whether the citing articles were kind of offering supporting, mentioning, or contrasting evidence. And so you can actually read more about how Scite works. We published a paper, so if you go to solutions, how Scite works, there's a kind of research article we published about the indexing pipeline, the deep learning model for classifying intent, and so on, to the extent that you're interested. But under the hood, we are a citation index that's leveraging large language models as a technology to kind of create a better experience. Okay, so, all right, I see some more questions. I promise I'll try to get to them, but I'm gonna try to hit some of these with the example I'm gonna work with. So, someone asked, is it possible? What are the most common prompts you use for random subject? So, look, to get the best of Scite and like random subject, it really depends, right? So I think when people want to learn more about a topic, it's hard to kind of craft the perfect prompt because you don't actually know what to say about this prompt because you don't know anything about the topic. And so you can literally do the same thing you probably did in a Google search, where you, like, if I was learning about GLP-1 agonists on Google, I would just search GLP-1 agonist. And then I would just kind of start to like synthesize information in my head based on different snippets I'm reading and build up that kind of intuition. I clearly searched this before last week during the last webinar. And you can get pretty good mileage with like vague prompts like that within Scite, but you have to kind of understand that it's not going to be very specific or focused on one thing. And so when the overview of GLP-1 agonists is a very vague prompt without a lot of focus on any specific area. And so it's going to cast a pretty wide net. You'll see that it's looking at research articles from 2013 all the way to 2023, or probably even newer. And it's looking at all sorts of things like diabetes and like insulin secretion and cardiovascular benefits and side effects and all this stuff, right? But you could probably deep dive and laser kind of focus on one of these depending on your interest. And so there's a couple things you can do here. So I think in the past with Peppa Pig, we were talking about searches and the level of control you have there. There's actually like ways to control the output in terms of the reference selection itself. So I see someone talk about how it missed an article that was important between 2006 and 2007. So you can actually like filter and tell Assistant to only use articles that were published within certain years. And you can do this in a couple different ways. You can actually like explicitly set the kind of year range filter as a setting, or you can say things like using papers published after 2018, give me an overview of the landscape around GLP-1 agonist research. And to some degree, you can incorporate information within your prompt itself to tell Assistant to automatically apply settings. So years are kind of the classic example where this works reasonably well. We'll see if it does. If it doesn't, though, you can always kind of set it explicitly using your settings. So we'll try this and hope it works. And then kind of understand that gradually over time, we'll be bringing kind of natural language patterns for other types of filters that you can auto apply using these settings. But right now, let's see what it finds. So even in the publications consulted, you're going to see articles published after 2018, right? I don't see anything published before 2018 in here, 2020, 2021, 2018. So I'm like reasonably confident this is going to work out in my favor, and I'm not going to have an exodus on this demo. And so I'll kind of go through some more questions while it's answering. Is it possible to filter the citing papers of a paper in the same way as in the main search? I don't know if I fully understand that question. I mean, I think if you're looking at a specific article, you can always open up the report page and then see what the citing articles are. But you can't like automatically bring them into Assistant if that's what you're asking. So maybe if you want to clarify if I misunderstood, that would be good to know. Okay, this is taking its sweet time because I'm doing a demo and it's got to make me look good. So we've got an answer with our new settings, and we see that we were asking for papers published after 2018, and lo and behold, every paper cited is published after 2018, and so we're getting a bunch of results that maybe are more relevant. And so, there's no right or wrong answer, right? But if you are aware of a field, maybe because it's in your domain, and you're like, it shouldn't just pick old research because the field changed drastically in the last X years, you can start to constrain it a little bit more using the filters kind of implicitly through natural language, explicitly through the year range, or even more subtly by just saying cast a wide net, but I want you to kind of prioritize newer references, which basically tells it when you rank the documents you find, instead of looking at relevance, actually prioritize things like recency, or in some cases, citation counts and things like that. So, pretty interesting stuff. We are getting an overview of GLP-1 agonists. It seems to be from relatively new research, and maybe this is a good launching pad for a kind of discovery workflow. Someone asked if you can kind of save bits of your work while searching. Yeah, so on one hand, like I would love to be able to create this like view, like a panel that just comes up on the right where you can just throw information in and kind of shove it away for later. We don't actually have that yet today, so we've got a bunch of stopgaps in place, but I totally get what you're asking for there. There's a couple things you can do. So you'll notice this like copy to clipboard icon in a bunch of different places, and it's the same icon and it does different things in different places. So when you're in Assistant, maybe you look at this answer and you're like, this answer and the references are pretty useful. You can hit copy, and if you go into Google Docs or whatever, you'll actually be able to paste out not just the output, but the sort of references at the end, right? So you'll kind of get everything at once as a part of that. So if you're kind of doing a writing task, you can usually pull your information out pretty easily that way. And you can also kind of export out the individual references themselves by kind of going here and hitting kind of download if you want to put them into like a reference library or some other tool that you're using for a bibliometrics task or whatever, or a lit review. Okay. Okay. So one thing you might look at, so there's, the sort of topic of like searching for content that's not in English is really interesting to me, because when you think about things like propagation of bias or kind of equity in research, we're in an interesting time where research is pretty much a global playing field, right? Translation software makes it easy for anyone, anywhere in the world to kind of participate in research. But there's a lot of research written in kind of non-English languages or in other journals that's really interesting that we sort of risk kind of missing out on. And so when we think about kind of documenting search strategies and everything information science, a lot of it is really about, articulating kind of what you searched and what you found. And the thing I was talking about in the original webinar last week is that with Scite, we really focus on the claims of the articles that are being written, right? So we really want to surface the sort of dialogue that's happening between researchers. And so, maybe you kind of, let's pick one. Okay, so maybe we find this article here, published in 2021, and they're talking about, I don't know, several peptide hybrids quickly populate the pharmacological landscape, and they're looking at these sort of dual receptor agonists. And the interesting thing is they're making a bunch of citations in text, right? So there's kind of this conversation happening between different researchers. And with Scite, you can actually mouse over these references and start to kind of find other papers that might be relevant or interesting at the level of the idea. Now, when I say this to a lot of people, they'll say, okay, but you're kind of surfacing content from journals that we don't really care about or aren't as good, or impact factor and all this stuff. And there's, I think, two sides to this coin. I think on one hand, there is an argument to be made that you really want to look at the kind of claims and these ideas that are being discussed, because it might actually be more interesting from a discovery or a white space perspective to find gaps in research. But sometimes, as a kind of counterpoint, Assistant by default will sort of downrank predatory journals and things like that. So we have some heuristics to kind of create a benchmark of quality in the references that it's picking up from. But sometimes you're doing a task and you're like, I need to just cite from like New England Journal of Medicine and Nature and Cell. And so you can constrain Assistant to only pick information from specific journals by using the journals filter. And so you can actually start searching things like Nature. I'm going to pick a couple. One, New England Journal of Medicine. Interesting. And maybe Cell. And see what comes up with these. So hopefully this works. But we should now kind of pick papers after 2018 about GLP-1 agonist research, ideally kind of constrained to content from these journals. And you actually start seeing Nature and NEJM DOIs and Cell DOIs. That's probably doing what we want. But you'll actually start seeing, I wonder if the Eurofilter still works as expected. So we'll kind of see how it goes. And oh, interesting. It's being weird. So let's see what happens here. I love live demos because you get fun things happening with tools. I'm actually wondering if it's like drafting this in the composing bit, but it's going to delete it when it fact checks. So we'll see what it does here. So you actually see the actual answer that it's drafting. The interesting thing right off the bat is there are papers it's picking up that are older than 2018. So I'm kind of curious what's going on there. But let's see what happens after it fact checks fully and go from there. And this might happen if, okay, yeah. So now it's looking at papers. So the first thing we want to make sure is it's actually filtering on the journals we care about. So it's looking at Cell, Nature, and so on. One thing I want to call out, so it does seem to be breaking the year filter, and we can try to explicitly set 2018 here. But one thing I really want to emphasize is that metadata about when research is published can be a little confusing, because sometimes there's like the date that it's kind of published online, and then there's a print date. And so, I would caveat that if you still notice like it's off by 6 months or something, it might actually be because of metadata issues there. So that's just an interesting thing to call out. What does the system do with thumbs up and thumbs down actions? Yeah. So this is a way for you to tell us the answer was dumb. So if you're like, hey, I asked this question and this answer was terrible, it's kind of a free form input to complain to us. And yeah. I actively use Scite, and one thing that bugs me, is it possible to make the labels of journals in the filter wider? Yeah, that actually, yeah, I noticed that earlier too. Yes, we can fix that. I'll make a note of that. Where can we see how the different journals are ranked and what your parameters are? So we don't have like an implicit ranking on every single journal. What we actually just do is downrank like the bad ones, like predatory journals, typically. So we use sources like Beall's List to find information there. But it's not like we are always picking Nature, for example, or we're not using things like impact factor by default. Okay, so yeah, so you'll notice here that when we specify the year range a bit more explicitly, then we kind of forced it to kind of constrain the document selection. So it's possible that the kind of the prompt version of it is a little fragile. Okay, but we were able to kind of restrict the answer and kind of get very different references selected, very different information, and very different kind of outputs over a different set of articles. And so the reason I kind of bring this up is that when you're using it as a launching pad for research, it can be a little worrying because you're not really sure like what else is out there, but you have a bit of a Swiss Army knife to really control it and refine the output and kind of compare different types of outputs. But sometimes, like as an expert, like you've already done a lit review in like a dedicated literature review tool, and you've got a list of articles that you want to do question answering on, or you've got a bunch of searches that you've done and so on. So not everything within here has to start with a chat. So within Scite, I think someone asked earlier if you can kind of collect information. So I talked about kind of exporting text through copy to clipboards. But what you can do is, I just heard a weird beep. I don't know what that was. Okay, what you can do is also kind of collect articles into dashboards. And so you'll see this like add to dashboard button everywhere. And what this is a way to kind of create collections or groupings of papers. So I'm actually gonna reset my settings just so I don't mess something up. And so we're going to go to tools. And when you go to tools, by default, you'll go into your dashboard view. So we're going to create a new dashboard. So I'm going to show you the kind of manual approach of how you can create a group of articles that you're bringing in from a different tool. Maybe use Zotero or Mendeley or Article Galaxy references, and you can kind of import references from different sources. Or you can kind of create like a manual list of articles. So let me try to do this where we do a webinar demo. We made this on our webinar. And what we're essentially going to do is upload a list of articles, in this case from a CSV file. So I prepared one earlier. And if you give it a list of DOIs, what you can do is create a dashboard that gives you an overview of what these articles are, right? So by default, you kind of get what the articles are, what the citation counts are, a view of sort of the editorial notices that these articles have received. So we have our own system for detecting this information based on changes to titles, like retractions and withdrawals. And so people will kind of, create groups of articles that are based on their own publication history. Librarians will kind of create this on groups of articles for their department or organization, and periodically check it to pull information out for bibliometric reasons. So you can kind of, look at this aggregate information up top, but you can also kind of come down to the list of articles and export, this information into different formats as well. So you can kind of take information in, pull it out based on what's useful for you. But what I really wanted to show you is that there's a button here that says Chat with Dashboard. And we'll over time work on creating a more natural experience. But if you click it, of course, that worked weirdly. What it'll do is take you to Assistant with a filter applied on the dashboard that you actually run. And you can always manually verify this by clicking on settings and then, setting the dashboard itself. So it really just becomes another kind of way to restrict that search strategy formulation. But instead of saying restricted to a journal or a type of publication, restricted to articles in this dashboard only. So we're going to do this, and maybe we'll just say, I don't know, can you summarize these papers for me? And while this loads, one thing I want to show you back on that dashboard. Okay, is this the dashboard we were looking at? Sorry, give me a second. Yeah, here it is. So we had 18 papers in this dashboard. That's kind of what I want you to pay attention to here. So, it's looking at all these different articles, and it's going to start composing a response to basically summarize or perform this task that you want on this exact set of articles. And this is really powerful because dashboards give you a way to kind of control the entire search strategy step, where maybe you were looking at me doing the demo earlier and you were like, it's crazy that he has to like guess what these prompts and settings to figure out the search strategy and all this stuff. If you want to do your own search strategy within Scite or a different tool and pull papers out, you can just incorporate them into Assistant to do the tasks you actually care about on that set without worrying too much about what it's picking up on. So when you do this, there's a couple things. So you can do kind of generic tasks like summarization. I'm gonna do something annoying and start counting. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times like this make me wish we had a numbering system. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So there's only 12 papers here, but we've got 18 in our dashboard. This can happen when you do a generic prompt on a set of articles, because it might actually just say some of these articles aren't really relevant depending on how vague your prompt is. The reason this kind of comes up all the time is people will say, what I actually want to do is take these articles I have from my literature review and pull information out of them for whatever I'm trying to do. And so I'm going to preface what I'm about to show you by saying, I realize it is kind of janky. I realize that not everything needs to be in a chat interface. We are going to make it better, but I'd like to show you the functionality for now because the core stuff already kind of exists. There is this option called use structured responses. And so we're just going to enable that, hit apply, and maybe we're going to change our prompt. So we don't really care about summarization, but maybe we say, what are the key findings of these papers? And so we're still applying our prompt on that dashboard, hit the check mark, and it's going to perform this task, but as you'll see, it'll be forced to kind of use every single article in that dashboard that you have without dropping anything. So while this loads, I will keep going through your questions. How do you define a predatory journal? Yeah, so we use Beal's list for that. From the point of view of researcher, is it necessary to write into an article that I used Scite AI for some parts of text? Yeah, look, I think ultimately, like, these are different tools, right? So if you're using something like Scite or even ChatGPT or Anthropic to help you kind of ideate on on the manuscript that you're working on, I think a lot of journals have kind of guidelines of kind of stating like what tools you used. And so I think that's a part of it. So what you'll notice here, before I keep going on to more questions, is we're now kind of saying, what are the key findings of these papers? And we're getting a tabular view where each row is a different paper from our dashboard. And you can actually quickly verify by going to the last page. Okay, cool, there's 18 articles, so we probably kind of covered all of them, and we did. Check this before I did this. And what you'll find is that the response column is essentially the answer to your question applied on each article. And so when you go here, you'll say, oh, okay, so according to this paper, like this is the key finding of this article. And if you mouse over it, you'll actually be able to see the kind of information that it's pulling from that article, maybe from the abstract or whatever else you've indexed, to sort of back up this AI-generated response about what this article is. And so you can actually incorporate this into literature review workflows where you can start to export this into a table and put it into other tools that you're using to create a bit more systematic view of the kind of attributes of different research articles you're looking at. I will sort of say up front that, you know, I like to use this. I don't like that it's in a chat interface. I don't like that it's squishy. I think it's something we're looking at pretty actively to kind of improve into a more dedicated workflow. So, you know, to the extent that you kind of do literature reviews or are interested in kind of paper level question answering, I'd encourage you to try this and to see what the behavior is like, because it will help us kind of define that future state of these broader workflows that we're working on. Okay, one thing I want to say, so we have 9 minutes left. I'm going to go through questions in a second, but I talked about dashboards, and dashboards are pretty cool because we created a manual list and we're able to kind of bring that into Assistant using, you know, maybe a set of DOIs that we found within Scite or from a different tool, like maybe you're using a systematic review tool elsewhere because you have to use different tools for your work. One thing you can actually do within Scite is create dashboards that are based on a search. So let's say I did tremelimumab and adverse effects. So this is an immune checkpoint inhibitor that I used to do research on. And so we've got about 800 results, and maybe this is a search that we care about, and we're doing some pharmacovigilance on this drug. You can click this icon here to create a dashboard that automatically grows over time. So we'll take this search strategy. I don't want email alerts because I'll be flooded, but you can do that if you wanted. And if you enable these alerts, if we ever detected new smart citations matching these queries, it would actually come to your inbox. And so when you make this dashboard, what you're going to be able to do is view the dashboard the exact same way this old one was, but then you can actually start to incorporate that set of 838 articles within Assistant, right? So you can actually start saying, oh, let's go, you know, I don't want to deal with Assistant trying to figure out how to do its own searches. I'm actually going to tell it how to do the search, save it through a dashboard to create that collection of articles, and then just do kind of natural language questions on that set of DOIs that I think are relevant to what I really care about. So, you know, depending on where you're starting from in your workflow, as someone who's either knowledgeable or maybe who has no clue what their field is, you can kind of tackle the problem in a lot of different ways using a mix of kind of purely conversational generative AI approaches and a mix of kind of classic search all together. So that is my spiel. Let me go through your questions. Can EndNote be added? Yeah, so we've talked to them. It's a little tricky. I think what I'm probably going to do with EndNote is it's hard to get like an API integration with them. And I think EndNote installations tend to be pretty custom depending on different customers. But what we can do is create a more streamlined workflow where you're not dealing with a CSV file, but maybe you're dealing with a file that you can easily export out of EndNote that you can easily import into here. So we've looked at that before. It hit a dead end, but it's on our radar. So I will keep that in mind. Is there any way to work only with articles from Scopus? I mean, so we are our own citation index, so we don't really have like a setting that's a Scopus only. So, nope, sorry. Not sure if this was answered. Could you also use Boolean? Yep. So yeah, so you can incorporate Boolean queries into your search strategy. And maybe I think I still have an example, or maybe I don't. I forget where it was, but yeah, you can edit your searches and incorporate classic Boolean search queries in here. The only thing with Boolean queries is you've got to use uppercase operators. Can you instruct Assistant to include page numbers in the response? So I think in some cases we index positional information. So I know we have like sections. I don't think it's something you would instruct it to do. I think it's more of a thing that you tell me that you want, and I figure out if I can include that information in the output. I'll take a look into that. I think, I mean, I get why you want to use it, so that makes sense. Can you add an article to your dashboard from a journal that's not in your database? Yeah, so generally, like the current version of Scite is very centered around DOIs. So as long as the article you're trying to add has a real DOI, you'll be able to add it into your dashboard. And so, you know, we're pretty competitive and broad in coverage with pretty much any other traditional citation index in that regard. Okay. Let's see. I got a result citing 4 articles, but only 2 references in the reference list. 2 of the citations are not linked. Daniel, you might need to email me directly and share that example so I can take a look at what's going on there. Are the results better using English as the main language? Yeah. So, you know, we've tested it the most on English. You know, if you try kind of other languages, I see people do it all the time when I do user interviews. You know, we haven't historically tested it like rigorously, so I'm not entirely sure how reliable the behavior would be if you tried to like prompt it in, I don't know, Chinese or Spanish or Portuguese or anything else. But the interesting thing I'll kind of say again is that, you know, with our classic search interface, if you search in a different language, because it's keyword based, you would expect to only find results in that language. With Assistant, the behavior is going to be slightly different because your non-English prompt might be translated into English by a large language model, and then it'll kind of expand the scope automatically, and it'll give you an answer in English. So I think you have to kind of try it out and see how that behaves. Okay, we've got a lot of questions. Do I have a Citavi integration? So we don't have a direct integration officially with them, but you know, generally the kind of system is pretty interoperable with other tools. So if you had a dashboard, you can periodically export that information into different formats. And I'm assuming that they have an import functionality to kind of pull those articles in. So if you're using kind of dedicated tools for systematic reviews, you know, you'll have abstracts in the exports here to kind of get the information you need, along with kind of our kind of smart citation information. So yeah, and then if you're kind of an enterprise customer, you know, we can kind of do custom exports here as well based on things that are of interest to you.
Ashish, sorry for interrupting. We're running out of time. We have so many questions.
Yeah.
Let me make a note on that. And we do have all of your questions saved. So for the ones of you who didn't get to them, we'll make sure to follow up with you afterwards. So many questions. We'll definitely just have to do a third version of this. 2 things I wanted to call out before we end, and yeah, just to end everything on time for all of you. We did mention that guide, and someone even mentioned they saw it, Ashish, on your screen pulled up. So I'm adding the link in the chat here right now to 2 things. First of all, you can request the demo if also you have like specific use cases. Maybe you work at a university, you're part of a corporation. So ask for a free trial or a demo. And then, of course, the handbook, which probably a lot have been waiting for. So you can act with the link that I just sent you. I'll also be sending out an email with the recording, in which I'll also include the link to this guide, put together with lots of research and love by Ashish. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Ashish, for answering all these questions and yeah, showing us how to make the most of Scite Assistant and the prompting guide. Okay, let's stop on time here. Thanks again, and hope to see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.